Sputnik, the space race and its impact on the American education system. During World War II, U.S. nuclear warfare was highly successful as a result of the dedication to the Manhattan Project, which was the development of U.S. atomic weapons throughout the 1930s and 1940s. The project made history on August 6, 1945, when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and 2 days later the second dropped on Nagasaki. While the bomb effectively ended the Pacific War with Japan, the effects were devastating as millions of lives were lost due to radiation poisoning as well as the explosion itself. The atomic bomb also served as the beginning of the deterioration of Russian-U.S. relations leading up to the Cold War. After the U.S. dropped the bomb, the Soviet Union was furious. The U.S. had beat them to a remarkable scientific and technological advancement. In their own eyes, Russia had been shown up by the U.S., while simultaneously falling behind the development of nuclear technology. Evidently, tensions brewed between the two global superpowers, the majority stemming from the Soviet spread of communism. These tensions were only exacerbated by the outbreak of the Cold War, and eventually the space race. During the 1950s, the space race first began at the height of the war on July 30, 1955. The U.S. officially announced their intent to launch satellites into space. 4 days later, the Soviets expressed the same sentiment. 2 years went by without any notable accomplishments from either side until October 4, 1957.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. Here, an artist's conception of how the feat was accomplished. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster, in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
Sputnik was a wake-up call for the U.S. government and NASA. With a newfound sense of urgency, they realized that it was necessary to catch up to and eventually surpass Russia. Overnight, the space race had become even more critical. Here's where some problems arose. The reactions to Sputnik in the U.S. were troubling to the government. Multiple surveys were conducted throughout the country asking the public about Sputnik and how the Russians were able to accomplish such a feat. One survey found that nearly 54% had no idea, and another 35% stated that the Russians launched Sputnik because they either work harder than Americans or because they're simply better in that field. Another survey also found that 50% of those surveyed felt that Sputnik was a blow to the U.S.'s scientific prestige. How could NASA develop similar projects in such a short amount of time without the adequate resources and programs to support satellite construction? The lack of understanding of the launching of Sputnik sparked conversations on how the Russians were able to support this program. Russian documents were later leaked explaining what kinds of measures were taken to develop the Sputnik projects. The Russians had several different branches of research that targeted all parts of satellite technology. Multiple university science programs were on the project, as well as the USSR Space Agency. The United States had not been dispensing these kinds of resources on the U.S. satellite development programs.
The lack of American understanding of the scientific and mathematical fields involved in space exploration projects like Sputnik drove them to enforce valuable educational reforms throughout the country. America, which came out of World War II as one of the top technologically advanced powers, was in a race with the Soviet to land a man on the moon, and it starts with the American understanding of science and technology. Further advancements took place on November 7, 1957, when the American government took aside a bond of $16 million to put towards further advancements of science and math educational programs in schools. Notable scientists like Stephen Hawking even became the face of this scientific revolution. Science and math programs in schools became more typical than ever before and featured more curriculums with more depth. These reforms were in effect beginning in elementary schools all the way to universities. While this impacted scientific and mathematical classes, majors in these fields were altered to be taught in new ways, and those who studied to be teachers of any level of education had to now navigate new curriculums in order to more adequately prepare students for futures in mathematical and/or scientific career paths. Congress went on to pass the National Defense Education Act, providing scholarships and fellowships to prospective STEM students. America was now in a new era of technological development that would push the race to get to space.